In my series on Edward Said's Orientalism, today I'll be reading from page 56 to middle of page 59 and then offering my thoughts about it. So here we go. So first of all, my apologies for it taking so long in recording these videos. But of course, you understand that, all of us have to live our lives, make our livings, and meet the family and other obligations. So I do these videos whenever I have time to research and then record. So in today's conversation, I will first be reading, as has been the practice, from the book itself. And then after I finish my reading, I will offer you my understanding of what has been read today. Now, previously, of course, we are in a sequence because here he is discussing the imaginative geography and how the Orient is imagined but also articulated. And he is in this part of the chapter 1 discussing 2 plays. Okay. And we will go into the detailed discussion of the plays as well, but I've previously given you references and my understanding of it. So just keep that in mind, and here I will offer you my reading first, and it's slightly long, but we are here to learn, and then I'll share my thoughts and ideas about today's reading. In the Bacchae, perhaps the most Asiatic of all the Attic dramas, Dionysus is explicitly connected with his Asian origins and with the strangely threatening excesses of Oriental mysteries. Pentheus, king of Thebes, is destroyed by his mother, Agave, and her fellow Bacchantes. Having defied Dionysus by not recognizing either his power or his divinity, Pentheus is thus horribly punished, and the play ends with a general recognition of the eccentric god's terrible power. Modern commentators on the Bacchae have not failed to note the play's extraordinary range of intellectual and aesthetic effects. But there has been no escaping the additional historical detail that Euripides was surely affected by the new aspect that the Dionysiac cults must have assumed in the light of the foreign ecstatic religions of Bandis, Cybele, Sabazius, Adonis, and Isis, which were introduced from Asia Minor and the Levant and swept through Piraeus and Athens during the frustrating and increasingly irrational years of the Peloponnesian War. The 2 aspects of the Orient that set it off from the West in this pair of plays will remain essential motifs of European imaginative geography. A line is drawn between 2 continents. Europe is powerful and articulate. Asia is defeated and distant. Aeschylus represents Asia, makes her speak in the person of the aged Persian queen, Xerxes' mother. It is Europe that articulates the Orient. This articulation is the prerogative not of a puppet master, but of a genuine creator whose life-giving power represents, animates, constitutes the otherwise silent and dangerous space beyond familiar boundaries. There is an analogy between Aeschylus' orchestra, which contains the Asiatic world as the playwright conceived it, and the learned envelope of Orientalist scholarship, which also will hold in the vast amorphous Asiatic sprawl for sometimes sympathetic but always dominating scrutiny. Secondly, there is the motif of the Orient as insinuating danger. Rationality is undermined by Eastern excesses, those mysteriously attractive opposites to what seem to be normal values. The difference separating East from West is symbolized by the sternness with which, at first, Pentheus rejects the hysterical Bacchantes. When later he himself becomes a Bacchant, he is destroyed not so much for having given in to Dionysus as for having incorrectly assessed Dionysius's menace in the first place. The lesson that Euripides intends is dramatized by the presence in the play of Candace and Tiresias, knowledgeable older men who realize that sovereignty alone does not rule men. There is such a thing as judgment, they say, which means sizing up correctly the force of alien powers and expertly coming to terms with them. Hereafter, Oriental mysteries will be taken seriously, not least because they challenge the rational Western mind to new exercises of enduring ambition and power. But one big division, as between West and Orient, leads to other smaller ones, especially as the normal enterprises of civilization provoke such outgoing activities as travel, conquest, new experiences. In classical Greece and Rome, geographers, historians, public figures like Caesar, orators, and poets added to the fund of taxonomic lore, separating races, regions, nations, and minds from each other. Much of that was self-serving and existed to prove that Romans and Greeks were superior to other kinds of people. But concern with the Orient and its own tradition of classification and hierarchy. From at least the 2nd century BC on, it was lost on no traveler or eastward-looking ambitious Western potentate that Herodotus, historian, traveler, inexhaustibly curious chronicler, and Alexander, king, warrior, scientific conqueror, had been in the Orient before. The Orient was therefore subdivided into realms previously known, visited, conquered by Herodotus and Alexander, as well as their epigones, and those realms not previously known, visited, conquered. Christianity completed the setting up of main intra-Oriental spheres. There was a Near Orient and a Far Orient, a familiar Orient which René Roussin calls l'Empire du Levant, and a novel Orient. The Orient therefore alternated in the mind's geography between being an old world to which one returned as to Eden or paradise, there to set up a new version of the old, and being a wholly new place to which one came as Columbus came to America in order to set up a new world. Although ironically, Columbus himself thought that he discovered a new part of the old world. Certainly neither of these Orients was purely one thing or the other. It is their vacillations, their tempting suggestiveness, their capacity for entertaining and confusing the mind that are interesting. Consider how the Orient, in particular the Near Orient, became known in the West as its great complementary opposite since antiquity. There were the Bible and the rise of Christianity. There were travelers like Marco Polo who charted the trade routes and patterned a regulated system of commercial exchange. And after him, Lodovico di Vorthema and Pietro di Via. There were fabulists like Mandeville. There were the redoubtable conquering Eastern movements, principally Islam, of course. There were the militant pilgrims, chiefly the Crusaders. All together, an internally structured archive is built up from the literature that belongs to these experiences. Out of this comes a restricted number of typical encapsulations: the journey, the history, the fable, the stereotype, the polemical confrontation. These are the lenses through which the Orient is experienced, and they shape the language, perception, and form of encounter between East and West. What gives the immense number of encounters some unity, however, is the vacillation I was speaking about earlier. Something patently foreign and distant acquires, for one reason or another, a status more rather than less familiar. One tends to stop judging things either as completely novel or as completely well known. A new median category emerges, a category that allows one to see new things, things seen for the first time as versions of previously known things. In essence, such a category is not so much a way of receiving new information as it is a method of controlling what seems to be a threat to some established view of things. If the mind must suddenly deal with what it takes to be a radically new form of life, as Islam appealed to Europe in the early Middle Ages, the response on the whole is conservative and defensive. Islam is judged to be a fraudulent new version of some previous experience, in this case Christianity. The threat is muted. Familiar values impose themselves, and in the end, the mind reduces the pressure upon it by accommodating things to itself as either original or repetitious. Islam thereafter is handled, its novelty and its suggestiveness are brought under control so that relatively nuanced discriminations are now made that would have been impossible and had the raw novelty of Islam been left unattended. The Orient at large, therefore, vacillates between the West's contempt for what is familiar and its shivers of delight in or fear of novelty. So to make sense of these passages, let us first go over the two plays. So in this section of chapter 1, Said is discussing Aeschylus's The Persians and Euripides' The Bacchae. Now the Persians is the oldest extant Western play that is available or that exists, and it's also one of the historical plays that was written and performed immediately after the Battle of Salamis, where the Persians are defeated. Another thing peculiar about the play is that it is narrated and staged from the point of view of the defeated Persians through the voice of Xerxes' mother, and there is also the ghost of Darius II, who is Xerxes' father. So that gives us the defeated voice, female voice of the East. Now when Said moves on to his discussion of the Bacchae, I hope I'm pronouncing it right, what is so peculiar about Dionysus, right, in the play? In the prologue, we learn why is Dionysus there in Thebes. He's there to take revenge, okay? But he has been traveling, and he is son of Zeus from a mortal woman who dies because Hera, the sister and wife of Zeus, convinces her to look at Zeus in his true form, and when she does that, she's struck by a bolt of lightning. So Zeus, to save his son, kind of plucks him out and sews him in his thigh until Dionysus is ready to be born. And then he travels, but he's introduced back into the household of his aunt, where he's mistreated and not accepted as equal. So he travels east. And when he comes back, he's coming as this god who has a following, the Bacchae, the women who follow him voluntarily. So the chorus in the play is completely Eastern, and Dionysus is introduced into the Greek society as this foreign god, right? And then in opposition to, let's say, Apollonian reason or the Greek reason, he's the god of epiphanies, right? But he also loves wine, and his followers have these dances of ecstasy in the wild, right? So he is the god of wine and pleasure and fun. And so that is offered as this foreign threat to Greek reason, right? Now, within the play, the first thing that Dionysus does is he converts all the females in the household of his cousin and the king of thieves into maenads, right? These are women who follow the rituals of Dionysus, but they are doing it under compulsion, under his influence, and they all go into the hills and do that. And then it is Dionysus's revenge on Pentheus, the king, who doesn't accept him as a god. So Dionysus convinces him to go and see what his mother and others are doing in the wild. But he tells him, why don't you dress like a woman and get on top of a tree and see what they are doing? And as he is doing that, the women are informed that there is, a peeping Tom up in a tree. A man is watching them. So they pull him down from the tree and rip him apart limb to limb. So that is Dionysus' revenge on Pentheus. So what Said is hinting at is that here are the two old representations of the so-called East, right? Both by European writers. In the Persians, the East, Asia, is defeated, and we hear its defeated voice. That's one impression. That's one idea of that imaginative geography we get. And then the other image is what comes across in Bakai, and that is East as mysterious, irrational, and dangerous, right? And threatening. So what he's trying to trace then is this idea that this way of looking at the Far East and the Near East. The Near East is the Levant and where now the Islamic lands are or were, right? That it is no accident. It is an outcome of this cultural, literary production, mythological production, right? And so what emerges out of it is a way of looking at the East, and he describes that towards the end of the passages that I read. And that is that East is either imagined that something that has been conquered or visited, or where people have gone and recorded it, like Herodotus or Alexander conquering parts of the Eastern empires. And that is the East, which is sort of romantically seen as a place to go back to. So the Crusaders are going back east to reclaim what they had lost, right? The place of the birth of Christ. And then, of course, there is the East that is dangerous. But anytime the Western writers talk about the East, if it doesn't make sense to them, it is either a copy of the West or something that has been revisited, re-represented, and maybe not the original. So Islam is a great example of it, right? Towards the end of these passages, he talks about it, that Islam, the early encounters with Islam wasn't seen as original. It was seen as a maybe bad copy of Christianity. Remember, a lot of medieval writers thought of Muhammad, the prophet, as a renegade bishop. So in their imagination then, people of the East, even when they create something original, it loses its potency because it is represented as not a good copy of what Europe might have created or what Europe thinks is the right thing. So in his discussion of these two plays, he's going to like 430 BC, right? What is he establishing? I mean, throughout this chapter, but also in the introduction, what he's establishing is that the way the Europeans and Americans think of the Orient, especially of the Islamic Orient, it is not just based in prejudices and ideology. There is a whole discourse of representation behind it, right? And it is so far deep in history that even when you pick up the earlier Greek plays, that way of looking at the East, thinking of it as dangerous, thinking of it as irrational, thinking of it as a copy of Europe and the West, is embedded in that. So that imaginative geography then is East as either at this exotic place or this dangerous place, but it is also creating the geography of the Western imagination about the East. So that's where we are in the discussion of the book and of chapter 1. I think in the next section, Said will go on to discuss the medieval and later engagement with Islam and with the Islamic lands. But this is so far, what I understand from this and what I gather from what I just read to you. Obviously, this is not an exhaustive account or explanation of the text. So if you have any questions, anything that you would like to add, please let me know, and I'll be very happy to respond to it. Thank you so much. Stay safe, take care, and I will now see you next time. Until then, peace and love.